it seems to be a theme of the Trump administration. If you think back to the minerals deal with Ukraine, it was kind of the same story. So clearly, his business mind, his deal making is front and center, much more than democracy, much more than any other kind of principled goal and value.
Can we begin, first of all, by discussing how this many people are saying this is essentially a huge contradiction, that you've got President Trump. He's a man who's campaigned against forever wars. He's campaigned against anything that doesn't put America first. He's got this America first strategy. And yet he's just sent US armed forces into a sovereign nation, essentially abducted its leader, albeit a dictator, and is now going to put him on trial. That's confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, that's explained in by two different ways, right? One, President Trump, Susie Wiles, and Secretary Rubio are ultimately products of Florida. Even though President Trump comes from New York, he has spent the last 10 to 15 years essentially going back and forth, more or less living in Mar-a-Lago. And he gets immersed, much as Secretary Rubio and Susie Wiles does, in the politics of Florida, in which Venezuela and Cuba and other illiberal democracies are front and center, even if you're not part of the Latino community. They obviously owe a huge debt, political debt to Florida. And they were getting a lot of backlash for all of the expulsions of migrants, which they have not stopped. And that leads me to my second point of why they're engaging in this regime change in Venezuela. For Stephen Miller, another very important person in the Trump administration, he is solely concerned with the influx of migrants into the United States. And one of the countries that has sent the majority of migrants into the United States is Venezuela. It is the source of the migration crisis in the whole region, affecting the US and other countries. So if you add all of that together, Venezuela makes sense, right? From a purely political perspective for them. What doesn't make sense is to get embroiled for the long term. And that's the question that many are now asking themselves. What do you mean the US is going to govern Venezuela? And we don't really have answers to that. It could be he could have misspoke. He could have been, just putting his skis, getting in front of his skis here. We don't know. He's also not a very good communicator when it comes to details, when it comes to explaining reasoning. So a lot more questions from the press conference than answers, honestly. But the reasons why for Venezuela you have to see it through both a migration and the Florida lens.
And I'm interested when you talk about what it really meant for the US essentially governing Venezuela until there is a quote proper transition, which is what President Trump said yesterday. He also said in that Mar-a-Lago press conference that the vice president of Venezuela had effectively been sworn in as president and will essentially do whatever the US wants her to do. And yet overnight, she has made a statement saying that Nicolas Maduro is the only president of Venezuela. So once again, confusion.
Yeah, very confusing. Secretary Rubio came out to say if she doesn't dance, she will, see the results. And look, there is no way they were able to get Maduro without internal support, right? There was somebody or multiple people close in the circle of Maduro that ratted him out. And it is highly likely that it was Delcy. And that they are just trying to stay in power for as long as they can, trying to save themselves. And if she is going to effectively do this transition, because the way it's being explained in some circles is that it first is contention, keeping the Chavistas in power so that there is no destruction of the country, avoiding Iraq, right? The situation that we had before. And then the second part of this is stability, and then moving on to a transition, which may be Edmundo Gonzalez, the president-elect, or it may be another election, right? So very to be determined at this stage. But going back to Delcy, if she is really the puppet, if you will, of the Trump administration, she still needs to control her security forces. She still needs to control the Chavista environment in the government. And so she'll have to speak to them in a forceful way, in a way that she is not seen internally as the puppet of the Trump administration. So that does make sense if you think about it through a domestic lens, not international. But 100% agree that, again, more questions and answers and very confusing in the last 24 hours.
Do you think enough consideration has been given by Donald Trump and his administration to effectively day two? You know, when we look at campaigns, you mentioned Iraq, other people may say Libya, they may say Afghanistan. Generally, American intervention around the world and regime change has not gone terribly well for the people in those countries. And I'm just wondering if enough thought has been given to what happens next. I was listening to John Bolton last night, who obviously used to work for the first Trump administration. He felt that it hadn't been given much thought.
Well, there will never be enough, right? Because you can never truly foresee every circumstance, all the things that come out of the woodwork. So it will never be enough. They have had 6 months. So if they have not planned for the day after, that's on them. They have been telling us for 6 months that they're going to invade. They have been knocking on the doors of all of the multilateral development banks, telling the banks that they need to prepare. They have been really promoting these plans that nobody's seen, but the plans of the opposition that are supposed to be plans for governing. And back when they had Guaido, the other purported president of Venezuela, in 2019, they did have plans. So it really would just be a matter of dusting them off, updating them. So it shouldn't have taken that long. So I would expect them to have plans, but it is just hard to foresee every single turn of the wheel.
It was interesting that when President Trump was speaking yesterday, he was quite dismissive of the opposition leader Machado, who, of course, lives in Norway at the moment, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe that's why Trump was slightly dismissive as well, because we know that that was something that he wanted. But he said she doesn't have the support in Venezuela. You also mentioned Edmundo Gonzalez, who was widely recognized as the winner of last year's election in Venezuela. Is it clear who the Trump administration views as being the next leader, the future leader? And does that tally with the Venezuelan people who ultimately need to make that choice?
It is the first time that the Trump administration has indicated any displeasure with Maria Corina Machado. And I think in general, the international community agrees that the president-elect of Venezuela is Edmundo Gonzalez and the power behind the throne is Maria Corina Machado. And I don't think there's any really discussion, even amongst the opposition, about this matter. Now, it is inaccurate to say that Maria Corina does not have the support of Venezuelan people. She does. They won by 37%, and mostly because of her, not because of him, right? What she probably doesn't have is the support of the security establishment in Venezuela. And that is probably what he meant. If she were to take office, it is unclear that she would be able to keep the country together, both because the whole government for the last 20 years has been taken over and destroyed by the Chavista regime, and the security establishment has been indoctrinated with Chavista themes. So the opposition has said in the past that they would only need to purge about 20% of their security apparatus, which seems optimistic. They would probably need to do more. And that is where I think the rubber hits the road with the Trump administration. They have just decided that, maybe she comes later, maybe we do elections, but right now she is not the right person for what we need, which is stability.
So, what happens to the remnants of the regime? I mean, you talk there about the challenges, the people who are Nicolas Maduro through and through and support him, who are in influential roles. Are they going to accept opposition? Are they going to accept the US, potentially boots on the ground, as Donald Trump said yesterday?
Most of the deep ideologues are no longer really there. They're there because of money. They're there because of graft. And so at some point, they either get paid off or they realize the gig's over and they're going to have to make money somewhere else. Otherwise, they're going to end up in jail. So I would assume, just like many of the opposition have had to leave the country for fear of their lives, these people are all looking for ways to depart Venezuela, so that they do not have to deal with the aftermath. And the five who had run the country thus far, which was Maduro, Delcy, the vice president, Jorge, her brother and foreign minister, Padrino and Diosdado, the two security establishment leaders, the five clearly are not in sync anymore because they sold out Maduro and they're now behind Delcy in this weird transition phase with the Trump administration.
And finally, I just want to ask you about oil. Obviously, Donald Trump was saying that some massive US companies will move in, they will improve the infrastructure. It will mean that money from Venezuelan oil will go back to the Venezuelan people, but also the US will get a cut. How will that go down in Venezuela?
Look, the Venezuelan people just want change. The reality is they have not had access or benefited from oil riches for the last 20 years. I don't think this is the top of their mind right now. The notion that the U.S. government would get paid by, either through retribution or oil revenue, it seems to be a theme of the Trump administration. If you think back to the minerals deal with Ukraine, it was kind of the same story. So clearly, his business mind, his deal making is front and center, much more than democracy, much more than any other kind of principled goal and value. But the Venezuelan people themselves are just glad to see Maduro out, excited about the prospect of transition. Um, Probably will be hung over in a few months when they realize that it's not exactly what they expected. But for now, they're celebrating.